আমি ওই কারণে বন্ধুকে মরি কবরে শুয়াই না তোমার দিল কি দয়া হয় না খোদা দিল কি দয়া হয় না আমি ওই কারণে বন্ধুকে মরি কবরে শুয়াই না তোমার দিল কি দয়া হয় না খোদা দিল কি দয়া হয় না আমি ওই কারণে বন্ধুকে মরি কবরে শুয়াই না তোমার দিল কি দয়া হয় না খোদা দিল কি দয়া হয় না আমি ওই কারণে বন্ধুকে মরি কবরে শুয়াই না তোমার দিল কি দয়া হয় না খোদা দিল কি দয়া হয় না আমি ওই কারণে বন্ধুকে মরি কবরে শুয়াই না তোমার দিল কি দয়া হয় না খোদা দিল কি দয়া হয় না তোমার দিল কি দয়া হয় না খোদা দিল কি দয়া হয় না তোমার দিল কি দয়া হয় না খোদা দিল কি দয়া হয় না তোমার দিল কি দয়া হয় না খোদা দিল কি দয়া হয় না তোমার দিল কি দয়া হয় না খোদা দিল কি দয়া 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 দয়া
Wasn't me, I swear. Good morning. Welcome to the second day of the Social Innovation House. Thanks to everyone that came this morning to an incredible meditation session. I have to say that it was surprising for me. I wasn't expecting that, but it was incredible. So tomorrow we have another one at noon. And on Thursday in the night, if you want to close the week with a little bit of calm and focus, I recommend you to come. And tonight we have a very special invitation for all of you. We have the Impact Soirée, which is a special night sponsored by Royal Salute. So we're going to have a party. We're going to give some awards, and we're going to listen to good music. So you're all invited if you want to stay during the day, or if you want to come back tonight, please check with Maria in the entrance, the registration. So the first panel of the day, for me, is a very special panel. We have around 10 years working, trying to change education. And you all know about the problems that education have. I don't need to explain it. But they are going to explain you what is happening with the solutions. What are the things that are changing in education, and how we can make an education for human flourishing, for the well-being of our children, our families, and our communities. So I'm going to introduce our moderator, Ross Hall. Ross is newbie in the Botnar Fondation, is the new director of educational programs. Something like that. It was a very complicated title. He came from Jacob Foundations previously, was part of Ashoka, has been working with WISE, with many other organizations related with education, and he's going to introduce our panelists. So over to you.
Thank you very much. Can everyone hear me without a microphone? Okay, I'll try with that.
No, but they cannot hear you in YouTube.
Aha. In which case, I will use this microphone. Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much indeed for joining this morning. I'm delighted to be here to host this panel on learning ecosystems. This is a continuation of many years of a kind of an obsessive quest I've had into how to transform education systems, which seem to me to be far too narrowly focused on a small part of the human being, on the individual, and on becoming economically viable as an economic cog in a giant economic machine. And I personally believe that we need to fundamentally transform that idea of education into something which is much more holistic. And I sometimes talk about whole places developing whole human beings to live for the whole world. So I am an unapologetic advocate of holistic development, and I think this is central to the conversation that we will have this morning. I'm delighted to welcome two very dear friends today, perhaps my only two dear friends, but that's another story. First of all, Barbara has been doing some really beautiful, sensitive work in the city of Cluj in Romania, which in many ways I think is a very interesting example of an emergent learning ecosystem. And Luis is one of the early pioneers of the idea of learning ecosystems. Many years ago, we would be spending late nights trying to figure out what we even meant by the term. And Luis is doing very beautiful work again in making sure that nature is central in learning ecosystems. So before we get moving into the conversation, Barbara, perhaps you could just say a few words about yourself as an introduction to the audience.
Thank you, Ross. Welcome, everybody. Without speaking about me, I wish first to share a quote that is much wiser than anything I can say about me. And this is the quote by Thich Nhat Hanh. And he said, "To learn is to love. Without love, learning is lifeless." And this is the world where I'm coming from. I grew up in a lineage of love, and I went through the traditional education as a chemist, studied sociology, so I call myself a social chemist or social alchemist to bring other dimensions of knowing and experiencing the world into what I do. And as such, my focus is dedicated very passionately to co-create and research alternative or new social systems that prioritize well-being of people, other species, and the planet. And as such, as Ross mentioned, cities as living systems is one of such examples, and there are others. And I've learned so much from Ross, and sometimes he says he doesn't speak many languages, but in fact, he speaks all languages. Sometimes this listening says more than speaking, and in Davos, there is so much talking, and sometimes listening is what matters more in learning. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Barbara. Luis?
Yes, well, welcome to all of you, and it's a privilege to be sitting with Barbara and Ross, tremendous people. And in my case, you know, I came actually from a family born and raised in Colombia, with a lot of association to farmlands, because my grandfathers and my families really were still from, you know, those generations that worked the land. And I had that privilege, I guess, even though I was born or raised in Bogota, which is a huge city. I had every weekend, every break, every small time, we were out in the fields, in the mountains, or somewhere out. And I didn't realize the impact that had until after I studied engineering and I did a Master's of Fine Art. So I'm one of the confused ones, I would have to say, which is a discovery in itself. I guess education and life wanted me to become something very specific. Maybe an engineering, working in an engineering firm and doing all these things. And my spirit, my wild spirit, never allowed me to comply. So I bounced off like a little pinball all over the place until I realized that my connection to the earth was what gave me life. And in that process, I realized that one of the key root causes of many of the problems we have is the human-nature disconnect. So in 1991, I started as a purpose looking at ways of how to create opportunities to reconnect people to the earth. And this is what brought me ultimately to creating Opepa 26 years ago, which is the nonprofit I founded to do this purpose. And I started working in education because I realized that the place where we were becoming most disconnected was in our homes and in our schools. Schools had forgotten that nature existed. We were learning in classrooms, in configurations not very different to this, where nature was never acknowledged. So I started looking at ways of doing this and realized and started developing what I call now nature-based education from a relational approach. And we're going to talk a little bit more about this. But this is really what moves me now, is understanding how nature has to be at the center of all the learning experiences. And there's one very good reason. It's because we are nature. And maybe the big issue is we have forgotten that. We need to remember we are nature, start acting as if we were nature, and learning as if we are nature.
Lovely. And I think the word ecosystem is indicative of this emphasis. Lots of people seem a little bit uncomfortable with co-opting this word ecosystem, which often biologists feel a bit offended, I think. But I think it's useful because it shifts us away from this rather more mechanistic idea of an education system, where people often see an education system as a machine with rules, with cogs, with actors. And this idea of the ecosystem, I think, broadens the idea, it broadens the mind, if you like, away from just looking at the classroom into a more organic conception of learning and development. Now, there are many definitions of learning ecosystem. As with anything, you could spend all day trying to figure out what is a precise definition. I think what's more interesting for us today is to try and unpick a little bit some of the core elements that we see in learning ecosystems around the world. It's an invitation for you to think for yourself around what might a learning ecosystem mean for you, for your kids even. A simple definition that I often use is that a learning ecosystem is a diverse and dynamic and trustful community, and we'll go into these a bit, each of these in some detail. A community that's working together and learning together, so it's constantly evolving, consciously evolving. And they're doing that to ensure that everyone in that place is learning to thrive together or learning for well-being. And again, we'll go into a little bit what that means. And in fact, maybe that's a good place to start, which is, Luis, you've talked a lot about bringing nature into this conception of education, the learning ecosystem. Could you talk a bit more about the ultimate purpose of the learning ecosystem?
Okay, so in order to talk about the ultimate purpose of learning ecosystems, we need to reflect on the ultimate purpose of being alive. Because I think, where are we all going and why we're going there? And if we think of it just from an anthropocentric perspective, we can find many responses to that. But if we think of it from a living systems perspective, we will only find one response. And this is the beauty of what I have found in terms of how we should move towards a common purpose. And if you look at life and ask the forest or ask the ocean, what is every element within a living system doing? And there's one person, Janine Benyus, the pioneer biomimetic thinking, biomimesis. She used to say, the basic principle is that life creates conditions for life to thrive. So I think that is the key purpose. Life creates conditions for life, and this is what has driven evolution. And if we look at learning experiences, evolution is the longest lasting learning process that any system has had. 3.8 billion years of learning. And this is what gives us the beautiful, magical world we live in. A process of learning continuously. So if we think of purpose and purpose of learning ecosystems, we have to go back to that idea. How do we create conditions for life to thrive together? not as humans, but as living systems. And I think for me, that purpose becomes central, because that is the common purpose in everything that lives. So that becomes my commonness. And I think that for me is the purpose of learning ecosystems, to really create conditions that allow life to thrive together.
And this would embrace conceptions of regeneration. I know we've got a few people in the room who are really working hard in promoting regeneration. So you might hear terms of learning for regeneration, learning for thriving, learning for flourishing. And Barbara, I think you might use the word learning for well-being. Certainly my foundation at the Botnar Foundation would advocate for this focus on learning for relational or universal well-being.
Yes, indeed. And what is well-being? There are so many definitions, but what I really like to say is simply well-being is living in right relationships. Relationship with yourself, with others, with communities, with the environment, and beyond that, with the cosmos. And having a balance between your inner experience and outside experience. And as we know, this has very often been neglected, that very often we are taught that well-being is what we have or what we achieve. And of course, this is far from the truth. And well-being in different languages, it's very important, and different cultures also have a very different meaning. And I wonder, in your own language, when you ask yourself, what is the right word for well-being? In one example, where we were working in Romania, we looked deeply into the cultural context, and they have a beautiful word for well-being. It said, stare de bine. Something like in French, bien-être, it's very similar, being well. And it has all these dimensions and of complexities around what it takes. And of course, once you are aware what truly well-being is, then you establish these relationships with all components that leads you to live well.
And I think what's really interesting when we adopt this idea of learning for well-being is it puts an emphasis on this idea that the child, the young person, the learner, adult learner, is being. And some people talk about well-becoming. And if you contrast this with the focus in most education systems, which are very focused on academic examinations, which takes a snapshot in a point of time in somebody's ability to have memorized and regurgitated some facts. It's a bit crude, I know. But mostly this is still how young people are being educated around the world. It's very individualistic. It's very focused on a small number of memory tests, and most of which are in service, supposedly, of perpetual economic growth. So this focus on learning for well-being really shifts the emphasis into a dynamic process of the learner constantly becoming more and more well in relation to their community, in relation to the environment. So this fundamentally shifts the perspective, I think, on what we're actually trying to achieve in education. I've had so many frustrating conversations at very senior levels in education systems, fighting for the inclusion of social and emotional learning in education, knowing that social and emotional learning is not enough. You know, social and emotional learning tends to get reduced also to a set of this 5 C's or whatever they say. And it's all good stuff, but even that is really not enough when you hear these comments from Luis and Barbara. So anyway, there's a fundamental difference in learning ecosystems in terms of the very purpose of education. That then, of course, translates into fundamental differences in the learning experience and environments that we need to provide, because we're not going to develop a right relation with nature, with ourselves. We're not going to develop compassion, love, empathy, etc., by sitting in rows behind a desk reading from textbooks. We have to fundamentally shift the experience and the environment within which we're learning. So I'll turn to you, Barbara. You've done a lot of work, particularly at the city level, to conceive of new learning environments and experiences in that level. Could you say something about your perspective on this shift of learning environment and experience, please?
Yeah, sure. So first, why cities? Cities are living systems, are in a way some kind of living laboratories. And as you know, around 70% of GDP, but also environmental destruction is coming from cities. Not only that, cities means very soon around 60% of population will live in cities. So we ask, what if we engage with cities in more of a place-based learning as a leverage point, on the planetary scale? And we have taken, thanks to the support of the Fondation Botnar, 5 cities as example. And you can see on your chairs, you have one example of our Cluj. It's the intermediary city in Romania, in the beautiful plain of Transylvania. It's around 500 people with the metropolitan area, very multicultural, very young, 10 university, very vibrant ecosystem, and very proud about their history of learning and education. So of course you cannot change the entire city. So what we did together with different stakeholders, with the municipality, with youth groups, with civic groups, with businesses, entrepreneurs, and the educational system, we created something that we call our Cluj, which is simply a living laboratory, and not just any kind of living laboratory. Some of you may have heard about living laboratory. It's a terminology that is used in social urban innovation quite frequently. But this is not just any kind of living laboratory. It is a living laboratory that focuses on values. So it innovates with values. And if we are to come to well-being of population, and especially focus on young people, we have seen that those values that you really need to focus on are starting with 2. The first one is trust, building trust across the stakeholders, but of course starting with yourself, that the young person or anybody else trust yourself, who you are as a human being in relationship with the ecosystem. And the second value that is very important is the value of care, caring, again, for yourself, for communities, and for the city and for the nature that is hosting the urban environment. So as such, this is also another initiative as part of this thinking was, you cannot do that as a project in 1 year. So the first term was 10-year period, because systems transformation and learning takes time and takes persistence. So we are now in year 5, and we have seen over 20 social innovation projects have been co-created with these stakeholders. They include various kind of mapping. So really they are based on various kind of mapping, looking at the ecosystem as a living system of relationships. So we use a lot various mapping, visual, participating mapping technologies, and also a lot of interdisciplinary research before we even co-create with communities various interventions. And I will close with that the most interesting was that when we look at what is actually needed in this city to focus on well-being, it was the clear answer was changing education. And most of the social innovation, including School of Possibility, School of Health, Learning Cube, and so on and so forth. So it's a multiple intervention that are all focused on changing the learning, bringing much more informal learning into the city. And you can look at more into details on this link.
Thanks, Barbara. And Luis, the city is particularly challenging when we want to bring nature into the learning experience. What's your perspective on the challenges there?
Yeah, I think there's several challenges, but it all starts in, again, the purpose and some of the things you had mentioned, in the sense that if learning is to acquire information of the past, then we'll learn in a certain way. And it's very teacher-centered because I have the knowledge, you guys are the students, you're empty boxes, I'm gonna deliver the knowledge to fill your box. But as full the box is, the more power you have. So also I use teaching and education as a leverage for inequalities. The other way of thinking of it is, learning as not only information, but also as a way to move towards learning to think, learning to relate, and learning to be. So our ways of being, our ways of relating, and our ways of thinking. And I think that is really important, because if we look at it that way, then cities for learning become really important, or communities for learning. Because what we have discovered is that there's a couple of things that are needed in order to activate this. The first one is really learning to connect deeply, or connecting deeply. And connecting deeply with ourselves, with others, with nature, like Barbara has mentioned. But this process allows us to increase empathy, and empathy not only with other human beings, but empathies with the more than human world. And I think this is important, and the words of developing our capacity to sense our interbeing. This is a key component, because it allows us to start falling back in love with everything that's around us. And that allows us to relate differently. The second thing is awakening what I call our naturalist within, which is basically learning how to sense the visible and the invisible. The visible is the information, is what we learn. We can learn about trees, we can learn about people, we can learn about things. But the invisible is the critical aspect we have forgotten, is learning about interactions, energy transfers, about relationships, how relationships work. If you look at systems are not healthy because of the parts that contain the system. Systems are healthy because they have healthy relationships. So it's the interactions that create the quality. So learning should be focused on exploring and having the capacity to discover, students and individuals, to realize, discover, and sense the quality of relationships. And this is a key component. And last, it would be the action. Acting for regeneration, acting for thriving, because once I'm deeply connected, so if we're deeply connected and I have the capacity to sense the quality of our relations, I can start acting coherently for the well-being of all of us. So this is critical. And in our case, what we did in cities, we realized, there are issues in each of those places. So we created an initiative that's called the Nature-Based Education Networks, School Nature-Based Education Networks. And we're working in different cities. We started in Bogota. We have 14 cities with this model working now, where we work with teachers to reconnect deeply with themselves, but through natural environments. So they actually connect deeply with nature too. And that opens their whole relational space. And from that learning or that discovery they make, they start working with students, with communities, with families, with principals, and involving other actors in the community. So involving, let's say, the public offices, involving private companies, and different actors in place. And they start working together to rethink their well-being within the learning space, and to think how they really want to learn, how they want to discover. And in that process, for example, in Barranquilla, we were able to start having children say, our learning environment is not promoting our well-being. And they, with the community and the families, started redesigning and adapting learning environments to be naturalized, which means that they brought in, even nature-based solutions for climate and weather. In Barranquilla is very hot. So building trees and forests within the schools to learn, to play, to start discovering, but also to bring birds they had not seen for a while. So the creativity of working together in intergenerational projects, intersectorial projects, starts mimicking the importance of diversity in the forest. Diversity as a source of potential, not diversity as the source of difference and conflict. And I think this is the big difference in thinking of learning ecosystems. And I know when we started talking about ecosystems, I was the first one to say, ecosystems, you cannot use that word because you're breaking the rules. Until we really started to incorporate nature and ourselves as nature. And now it makes sense to create ecosystems that are smart, that learn together, that discover together, and that are able to take information from the past, but put it into context into the present for the well-being of the whole community. And that was really important.
No, what's really clear to me is when you look at examples of learning ecosystems around the world, there is this emphasis on holistic development, and there's a recognition that in order to help people develop holistically, there's a need to provide a wide variety of learning experiences. It's learning through projects, it's learning in the community, it's learning with nature, certainly it's learning through making, moving, meditating, etc. Many things which are not the norm in most education systems. And of course, now with the rapid and increasingly rapid emergence of digital spaces where young people are learning, whether we like it or not, they're learning things. There's a really strong need now, I think, to take care of these digital spaces so that learning is equitable and it is safe and it's positive. And I know, just briefly, Barbara, you've been doing something around the digital space. I mean, if you would like to flag that as a piece of shameless self-promotion, you'd be very welcome.
Yes, it's actually, I will promote those who are actually doing it. I'm a midwife. I give birth to these initiatives, and I'm very happy if they flourish. And indeed, we created in Romania, that came out of this city living laboratory, an extraordinary initiative that is called School of Possibilities. And you have these cards here. And what is it? So, as you know, in most countries, the way the education is structured, it's always top-down. And imagine what if high schoolers would be listened to and they would have a word to say how they want to have teachers, how they want to have exams or no exams perhaps, what kind of classrooms they want to have, maybe in nature, outside, and so on. So what we did, we created a youth data collective and we asked them which 20 objects they would like to speak to within educational system, and they selected teacher, of course, principal, grade book, exams, and you see many of these, you can see these 20 cards. And then we engage with artists, local artists, to actually illustrate these objects, and we created together with high schoolers an application and AI expert and interactive experience designers, so-called School of Possibility. And the School of Possibility is a listening tool that we can listen, and you can be, high schoolers and teachers can be in conversations to share stories that they like or don't like, and they can share stories to imagine school otherwise. And then, of course, there's a huge set of data that can then lead to informed policymakers. And in the country like Romania, that education is really behind and very top-down and very, I would say, still punishing, if you don't comply. So this is really unleashing an extraordinary imagination and possibility that can feed into the educational reform on the country level. And just imagine that every country would have a school of possibility, and all high schoolers or whole schools could speak, including parents, staff, and everybody. Just imagine where we could get using this kind of tools, but I have to mention it's important that it is not only the generative AI which we used, it needs to be, and that's how it is designed, it needs to be an interactive physical, so-called phygital experience. And it's really, I invite you to follow what's coming out, and this can go anywhere in the world.
Super, thank you. And I think you can pick up a leaflet somewhere in this room. Is that correct, Barbara? There, oh, you have one there. Yeah, super. Okay, great. Okay, so learning for well-being, holistic learning, requires a diversity of learning environments and experiences, some of which need to be provided in schools, but schools can't do it alone. And so there's therefore the third piece of the learning ecosystem is the need for a diversity of actors to be working together and learning together in providing these learning environments and experiences. Teachers need to work with families. There need to be school leaders involved, administrators involved, researchers, and not least of which young people need to be at the front of this. And so often education systems are done to young people. It's very rare to see young people actually being trusted and put in charge of their own learning. So there's a need, in other words, to weave together, and I use that word deliberately, weaving together. This is a term that many of us increasingly use to denote this practice of connecting people and projects in synergistic and purposeful ways. So weaving these different actors together into a trustful community who are working towards this common idea of learning for well-being. And I wonder, Luis, if you'd like to give your perspective on this challenge again of weaving. How do you go about this weaving together this type of learning ecosystem?
Okay, thanks, Ross. You know, when we talk about weaving, we first have to talk about networking. We're used to creating networks, and networks are, you know, mostly transactional networks where, you know, there's something to be transacted. When we talk about weaving, we move one step beyond. We talk about entanglements. We talk about connections that are deeper and really thrive on the interactions, but not on the transactions. So it's the energy that is being put forth. Think of it almost as a gifting economy. When we weave, we actually connect on the fundamental and most significant components that are mostly subtle, but we start bringing in abundance into the system. And if in our case, you know, 50 people bring their abundance into a place, the place is going to be extremely abundant. But if we bring in our scarcity, there's going to be very little abundance. I'm not sure if I'm being clear in the idea, but in this process, weaving is actually creating that common purpose, making it visible, making it tangible, so people can start learning together and building that space where we can thrive together. And I think that's why thriving together and learning to create the conditions for life to thrive is so critical, because it's that place where we can always hold each other accountable. Are we building a space, a relational space, where we're thriving together? If we're not, what do we need to adjust? How do we adjust it? But it's all based on the subtle qualities of the relationships. And I think this is really important in weaving. The other thing is that weaving requires the acknowledgement of diversity, like I said, not as a means of difference and separation, but actually as a means of opportunity, which means that we need translators. There needs to be people that can translate all the languages we use, which many times are the ones that separate us, into bridges of understanding that allow us to realize that we're actually working for a common purpose. And in that process, you can create like we've seen both in my initiative, in Barbara's initiative, intergenerational collaborations, co-learning, and building together. The other thing is that teachers shift in their role. Right now, many educational systems, teachers are who teach. And I really would challenge that into the future. For me, teachers are the guides to discovery, are the guides to experience. So if we have teachers that are really just creating the containers for students to discover, to learn, to connect, to love, then we will have learning that's very different. It doesn't mean that we're going to leave knowledge and past knowledge behind. We'll integrate it in a different way, and that's where also AI will play a really important role, because AI and digital world right now can contain a lot of the information, but the digital world cannot become the guide. That is the role that teachers need to really appropriate, use technology, use the information, but really empower themselves to become the guides of experience and learning, of discovery.
And so there's a need, it seems to me, in order for these diverse actors to really come together and want to collaborate in systems which are often pushing people apart. Let's not forget the challenges of teachers even collaborating with themselves, let alone with families, with school leaders, and with all the administrative levels in education systems. It seems there's a need for a fundamental shift in mindset. You've referenced some of those ideas, Luis. What's your perspective, Barbara, in terms of the shift in mindset that's required in order to realize this type of learning ecosystem?
Yeah, it's really interesting you mentioned that. I will. You may know a Harvard professor, Keegan, and he wrote a book, Immunity to Change. And he's looking at the current population, and it's estimated, if we look at the current population of adults, particularly, there is around 60% of people that have so-called socialized mind, with almost no ability to change. They conform. That's a majority. Around 35% is self-authoring mind. To some extent, they do improvise, so they would say it's a traditional innovator, so to call. And the rest, only small percentage, is this self-transforming mind. And of course, it doesn't mean that all these big percentages cannot change, but they need conditions. And we have to provide conditions. And our system is structured in a way, maybe I say through the story, when you plant a lettuce and the lettuce is not growing, you don't blame the lettuce, oh, you did a bad job. You failed, or you give a grade. You create conditions to grow with the soil, with the water, and so on and so forth. And this is what we need to do, to create the conditions for young generations or adult, doesn't matter, that allow for the mindset to shift. And I would mention maybe 5 practices that I have seen are very helpful, and they're also very playful. And one is imagining future, imagination, cultivating imagination. The second one is remembering. Memory is very important. In Davos, Davos has ancestors go all the way to Neolithic. How many stories do we hear today about the land and the ancestors that were present in Davos? So remembering, we are all members of our beautiful planet Gaia, not just memories 100 or 200 years back, but all the way. Then the third one, and they go in parallel, is sharing power, distributing resources. And 2 more, very important, cultivating presence. Today was a meditation here. What a wonderful start of a day to be truly present, who we truly, truly are as humans, Homo sapiens sapiens, human to be aware to be aware. What an extraordinary species we are. We forget. And only 300,000 years old. A little spider is 400 million years old. We have to become aware who we truly are. And the last practice, I would say, and maybe this is actually the first one for our future, which is storytelling. We have forgotten storytelling. But not just any kind of storytelling, storytelling otherwise. And I would say, I would write the wise as a wisdom with big letters, telling stories otherwise. And indigenous people have preserved the oral traditions of storytelling. We have forgotten to tell stories. We are not equipped. So these are the five practices that I think profoundly help us to shift our mindset and bring us back in relationship to fall in love with the world again.
Mm-hmm. And this is central to what I hear and understand as a mindset shift, this biophilia, loving life, falling in love with life. And an ecosystemic mindset or an ecological mindset seems important, to be able to see oneself in the context of everything else. And there are probably many more. And so this, in a way, has hopefully been an invitation to think of the idea of learning ecosystems essentially as a shift in mindset, a shift towards developing the whole human being for well-being, relational well-being, perhaps we would call it. A shift then towards recognizing a need for a diversity of learning environments and experiences. A shift towards this idea of the whole community coming together and working together and learning together how to do this work. And perhaps ultimately the shift to become aware of our own selves as aware beings in that learning ecosystem. We're not done yet. We would certainly welcome any questions or comments that you may have.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me? Hello? There we go. Okay. So I'm quite, oh wow, I'm getting filmed too. I'm very curious. So you're talking a lot about human flourishing with education and the digital component. And I'm really curious what resistance or pushback you've gotten from youth who are we're not just talking digitally savvy, but digitally addicted. And so if you're talking about being in nature, but and this is not my area of expertise, but I do care about this issue, where so much of their identity is digital, so much of their community is digital. So even though they may want to experience a more integrated educational experience, I'm just curious, have you seen any pushback from young people? And in particular, what has also been the receiving that you've received from parents?
Sure. Thanks for the question. I think this is really important. And I'll start with a quote from Richard Louv, who wrote The Last Child in the Woods. So it's a worthwhile book to read because it's a book where he defined what is called nature deficit disorder. But from his writings, he used to say, the more technology we have, the more nature we need. And this is a key point. In the work we've been doing, obviously there is resistance because as kids are born and grow totally away from nature in very artificial environments, they lose the capacity to relate with nature in a one-on-one, in a very close or intimate way. So the resistance is a resistance to the unknown. It's a fear of the unknown because different to my way of my upbringing, I was born and raised in the mountains, in the fields. So for me, that was my home. If you ask many of the kids, where is your home? They're not going to associate it with nature. So I think that is the challenge. Nonetheless, when we start bringing children and giving them the opportunity to actually involve their mind, their body, their heart in nature, in a group, in an experience that ultimately makes them realize that the world has many other things to offer, they really love it. And so the pushback is relatively low. The pushback is associated to fear of going outside, to fear of the unknown. But once they're activated, I think what we've realized is that children, especially if it's done constantly throughout the educational process, it really modifies the core of who they are, because they acknowledge their relationships in a much broader capacity, and it's now no longer their relationship with their device. It's actually their device in function of their relationships with others and with nature and their own experience. So learning to have experiences is also something that has to be learned. You know, to be able to sit in silence or stand and see a sunset in silence and enjoy a transcendent experience that nature can provide you. I think that is another challenge. We're putting in education too much noise. So there's very little silence, very little space to listen to nature, to listen to others. So this is another quality that really kids like once they discover it. But we need to create the conditions for them to discover it. That container is fundamental.
Barbara?
Yes, I would like to suggest, from our experience, 3 things. Beauty. We have forgotten importance of beauty. Bringing beauty into any kind of experience. We work a lot with artists, visual artists, sound artists, any kind of artistic experience. It's very important. Materials, how the materials feel, even if it's not possible to go to the nature. So beauty has an extraordinary importance. It also generates, how you pronounce it, awe. Awe? Is that, yeah? Awe, which is essential for curiosity. Then joy. We have forgotten to bring in joy into our life. Joy, everything, experience has to be joyful. And of course, play. If you go to the museums and they have museum rooms and you see kids playing and you see parents sitting and not talking to each other. And we need to bring this play into every experience and to adult experience as well, of course.
Thank you.
Thank you it's a fascinating panel. I'm just wondering about the role that food can play in helping not just children but adults as well to flourish. And I run a social enterprise called GIY, which stands for Grow It Yourself. So we teach people how to grow food as a way to develop food empathy. You used the word empathy a number of times, but one of the big disconnects in society, I think, is not just from nature but from food, how it's created, how it's produced. And it struck me when you were talking about the work you're doing in cities we run a program called GIY Neighborhoods, which tries to bring food growing as a nature-based learning solution into cities, and it's something that can be done very, very simply and in every location, in homes and schools and communities in cities. And I'm just wondering what role you see for food in helping humans to flourish in that environment.
Let me just briefly respond and then pass over, if that's all right. I mean, first of all, it is shocking how many young people have no idea where their food comes from. It's absolutely shocking. I can never remember the statistics on this, but it's really incredible how few young people really understand where their food's coming from, what the impact of growing that food is, etc. And at the same time, I can totally see how learning experiences which focus on food can be extremely transformative. I've seen this in many places. And that might include growing food, but then the harvesting of food, the preparation of food, the eating of food, the cleaning up of food. And often one of the resistant points that I find when I talk about food in education is this slight fear that, this is something additional, we've got to do another thing. But actually, the reality is you can learn maths with with food. You can learn geography, you can learn biology, you can learn history, you can learn pretty much everything in and with food. So I'm a very strong proponent of bringing food into the educational experience. I don't know if either of you have any...
Yeah, I would like to, first of all, recommend you check out the Conscious Food System Alliance, which is a little pioneering outskirt of UNDP, and I've been involved with that for a long time. But it's really bringing, how do we think conscious food systems and also intentional food, and that is really pertinent into learning. But if you look at food, I agree with Ross. Food ultimately in the schools we've been working with becomes the connector between the visible and the invisible. And let me explain. So food actually has to do with the procurement, with the administration, with the staff, the cooking, with the waste. But also food has to be in the procurement with the farms, so with relationship with the community. And then if we bring students and learners into food as a learning experience, then we realize that the school expands. The school can become, the farm can become the school. The gardens, the food gardens in the neighborhoods or in the school are part of the learning experience. But that relates to the cooking. So cooking as a heritage, also a way of bringing ancestral knowledge and relating our place with our food and our community of more than human beings, and understanding how we prepare food. The love and how that is an incredible ingredient. Care, love, and how food nourishes us, but at the same time, waste. So how do we do this whole thing to understand food, to reduce waste, or create waste that actually regenerates into other things? So if we look at food, food is an excellent example, not only to learn the different areas in learning, but also to understand the interconnections and dependencies that are in the system. And ultimately, food nourishes us. So if education nourishes our brain and food nourishes our body, we need both to really learn in a very wholesome way.
Yeah, thank you for this beautiful morning. My name is Geert van der Veer, and I'm also involved with food production and learning. And we're talking about youngsters right now, the youth. And I'm wondering, we have asked people, what do you know about your food production? Asking them literally, do you know how your food grows? And only 4% or so can answer this question, yes, I do know. So in the field of education our young people, hoping that they will become the board members of the future that do know how to connect and do stuff, how do you see this immense journey that we have to go? Because now we are talking to people in boards, in the ministry or whatever they are, who do not know anything about what you say right now. I think it's a hard. How do you see how to implement this in future? Do we have to be depending on the pilot projects, or is there a strategy to get it into the system maybe a little bit quicker? I think that's a very important thing.
Again, I'll hand over. I certainly don't have a particularly concrete response to that. But I can certainly see, I can see two things which seem important to me, one of which is to get young people on boards now. So young people who are enlightened, I think, need to be given a voice now much more than they are, not just tokenistic. Let's not have them singing and dancing on stages. Let's really get young people into boards. And then secondly, we also have to be patient. There's no shortcut for the transformation either of systems or for the duration it takes to educate ourselves as human beings. We have a very long gestation period as human beings. So there's a degree of patience that we just need to have, but there is also this urgency by which we need to act, giving young people a voice, in my opinion.
I can just share an example. Since once we designed School of Possibilities, of course, we were interacting across the whole ecosystems and with the youth. And of course, they chose food as one of the cards, they want to speak to, but not just food. They chose, was very interesting, I was not familiar with it. It's specific to culture context, and I'm sure there are different culture contexts everywhere. They chose corn and lapte in Romanian, which means bread and milk, and this is what they get as a meal which everybody hates in the school. So, and they wanted to open up conversations. What is it that we want? Where it's coming from? You know, it was really complete lack of awareness, but curiosity and eagerness to change it. It's clearly there, and I think it's really important to speak to all those people, you know, not just us doing it, we think we know, but have these conversations with the youngsters. They have so many stories to tell, and listening to that and co-creating with them, I think this can go a long way. I cannot imagine almost a better example than conversations about food, because everybody eats, and we are not what we eat, we are what we metabolize, and the whole system gets in. It's really beautiful.
Luis?
I would just add that definitely changing narratives is a key component of it. So the way we tell stories and the stories we tell is going to be really powerful in shifting the things we do. You know, also the things we do shift the stories we tell. But we usually focus on what we do, not the stories we tell. So we need to improve our narrative, our storytelling, to create narratives that really engage. And in education, bringing food, bringing more than human elements into the classroom and taking the classroom out into nature will allow kids to have, let's say, an imagination that can involve a lot of other elements into the narratives. And I think narrative changing is going to be a key component in system change, because it will provide the language to tell and to speak, you know, with a louder voice, especially to youth that might be restricted in how they speak because they can't really imagine those relationships. So I really think narratives is going to be a key component.
Thanks so much. Well, we've run out of time. We could, can we take one more? Yes, the organizers aren't in the room, so quickly.
Okay, so I'm Jackie Malouf from Lebanon. I wonder, where does the component of health fit? Because when you speak of well-being, there is no well-being if you're not in good health. And my second part of the question is, what do you think should be the role of the ministries of education? Because we are talking about changing systems. It would be very small scale if we go by pilot projects, but if we get on board the ministries, then we have a policy change. And then we can do the change, of course, not a shortcut, but maybe quicker. So I would like to know your feedback. Thank you.
Of course, yeah. Would either of you like to take the question on health? Barbara, maybe?
Sure. Yes, so I'll answer briefly since we don't have time, but it's the question how we perceive what health is. And I will go into origin of the world and relationship with other meanings. Health, whole, and holy have the same origin. And I think this is the answer. We just need to change this perspective that health is whole and sacred. Not just our own health, but health of the planet. That's where it comes in.
Yes, and I think often in this term well-being, one would encapsulate physical and psychological health and relational and spiritual well-being also. Let me just quickly respond to your question about ministries of education. If we want this to become widespread, which I think we do, we have to work with ministries of education. And I think there's a really crucial role to play for ministries of education, one of which is to fundamentally shift mindsets so that they are seeing the development of the whole human being as the ultimate objective, not getting X number of kids through examinations. And it also requires them to loosen their grip a little bit on trying to control teachers and control schools, and to do this in isolation of other departments. They need to soften their grip, they need to encourage trust, and they need to therefore allow schools to work with other ministries, with the health ministry, with the social care ministry, maybe with the agricultural ministries, etc. So I would say it's a softening, it's an opening that we need to see in ministries of education, which is very difficult to do. And so we are always welcoming conversations with ministries who are ready to shift their mindsets and to open to these new ideas. So in summary then, the learning ecosystem centers on the holistic well-being of everyone in it. It requires a focus on a diversity of learning environments and experiences. That requires this softening, this working together among many different actors, this weaving of the learning ecosystem. And all of this at the deepest level requires us, I think, to model an open mindset and to model trust and to model a willingness to work together. Thank you very much, Luis and Barbara. It was a pleasure to have this conversation this morning. And thanks, everyone, for listening. And hope you have a great day.
Russ, for those who have questions or want to engage, we can go to the second floor. There's rooms where we can sit and talk, and that way they can prepare the space for the next session.
Thank you. I wanted to tell you that I've visited Romania, and it's fascinating.